Imagine being 24 years old, stepping into a spotlight so bright it changes your life forever. One move, one song, one night, and suddenly the whole country is staring at you like you're not even human anymore. But what if the greatest moment of your career also opened the door to everything that would break you? What did America really see at Motown 25? And what did it completely miss? Tonight, we're going back to the moment a 24-year-old Michael Jackson shocked television so hard, the culture changed overnight. But this is not just the story of how the frenzy began. It's the story of what people thought they were seeing, not knowing what was really happening. The rise, the hysteria, and the private bill hiding behind the public miracle. Before the glove, before the fedora, before the moonwalk became a global obsession, there was a little boy in Gary, Indiana being trained to be perfect before he was ever allowed to be a child. Michael Jackson did not grow into greatness the way most stars do. He was pushed into it, built inside it, trapped inside it. His father, Joseph Jackson, ran the household with fear, punishment, and relentless discipline. Rehearsals went on for hours after school. Mistakes were not brushed off. They were remembered, corrected, sometimes beaten out. That kind of pressure can create excellence. It can also carve loneliness so deep that even fame can't fill it. And that is where the real story begins, because the world would later look at Michael Jackson and see control, precision, magic. But underneath that impossible polish was a child who learned very early that love could feel conditional, that applause could feel safer than home, that being extraordinary might be the only way to survive, and some wounds cut deeper than the public ever understood. Joe Jackson reportedly mocked Michael's appearance, especially his nose, during the exact years when a young boy is learning how to see himself. That humiliation did not disappear when Michael became famous. It followed him, it stayed, it grew. Years later, millions would stare at his face and form their own conclusions. Very few understood that part of that pain had started in childhood, inside his own home. That's what makes 1983 so important. By then, Michael wasn't just the gifted kid from the Jackson 5 anymore. Thriller had arrived. He was no longer chasing his future, he was approaching it fast. And when Motown 25 came calling, he reportedly did not rush in out of loyalty or nostalgia. He hesitated. He wanted a solo moment. He wanted Billie Jean. He understood something almost nobody else fully understood yet. This would not be a reunion performance. This would be a separation, a line in history, the exact second he stepped out of the past and into something larger than stardom. But what happened when he crossed that line was bigger than even he could control. On March 25, 1983, inside the Pasadena Civic Auditorium, Michael Jackson walked into one of the most important 5-minute stretches in entertainment history. When the special finally aired on NBC on May 16th, more than 47 million people watched. In a pre-internet America, that meant one thing. The entire culture moved at once. One night, one performance, one shockwave. At first, it looked like nostalgia. Michael came out with his brothers, the old songs, the familiar smiles, the echo of a younger America. But then the group stepped aside. The bass line of Billie Jean kicked in, and in that instant, television stopped being television. It became Coronation, the glove, the loafers, the sparkled socks, the fedora, the stillness, then the explosion of movement. People gasped because they knew they were seeing a transformation in real time. Not just a singer becoming bigger, not just a star becoming hotter. They were watching a human being become mythic. What many viewers would forever remember as the Moonwalk didn't just electrify the room. It altered Michael's place in culture. Overnight, he became something like America's first true pop TV shockwave of the modern video age. A black artist crossing barriers so fast, so completely, that the culture had no model for what came next. And that is where the blessing became dangerous, because what people saw that night was mastery. What they did not see was the burden now attached to it. They saw elegance, he felt pressure, they saw confidence. He carried years of fear-based perfectionism. They saw someone fully in control. He was stepping into a level of fame so unprecedented that there was no safe map for how to live inside it. That is the curse of being first. When you are the first to reach a place no one like you has reached before, the world celebrates you with one hand and dissects you with the other. Michael's success was not ordinary success. It was symbolic success. He wasn't just becoming huge. He was becoming a screen onto which everybody projected awe, fantasy, suspicion, envy, and fear. And then, just as his rise became unstoppable, the damage began. In January 1984, during the filming of a Pepsi commercial, pyrotechnics ignited Michael Jackson's hair. He suffered serious second- and third-degree burns to his scalp. It was not a minor accident. It was a life-altering trauma. The burn damaged hair follicles permanently, contributed to years of reconstructive procedures, and became one of the hidden foundations of the chronic pain that followed him for the rest of his life. Think about that contrast. The public saw the most exciting performer alive. Behind the curtain, he was undergoing agonizing scalp treatments, surgeries, tissue expansion procedures, sedation, recovery, and pain management. He was teaching the world how to move, while privately learning how to endure pain that most people around him never truly felt. And still, he kept going. That's what makes this period so heartbreaking. The rise wasn't fake. The triumph was real. The genius was real. The wonder was real. But the suffering was real too. And the more impossible he looked on stage, the harder it became for the world to imagine that anything fragile could be happening underneath. Soon, people would stop asking, "How is he doing this?" and start asking, "What's wrong with him?" That question would change everything. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, Michael Jackson was no longer being covered like a musician. He was being interpreted like a mystery. His body, his face, his voice, his habits, his privacy, his pain, all of it became public property. And one of the cruelest parts of the story is this. Some of the things people mocked most aggressively were tied to real medical suffering. In 1983, the same year as Motown 25, Michael was diagnosed with vitiligo and lupus. Vitiligo caused the loss of skin pigment in visible patches. Lupus brought inflammation, skin problems, sensitivity, and likely worsened hair loss. As the vitiligo spread, dark makeup could no longer hide it. Eventually, depigmentation treatments were used to even out his skin tone. But to the public, that medical reality was twisted into a moral narrative. People didn't say, "He's sick." They said, "He's trying to become someone else." That gap between appearance and truth became a prison. People saw umbrellas, hats, masks, and wigs. Reality, sunlight sensitivity, scalp damage, autoimmune disease, and the permanent effects of the Pepsi burn. People saw a changing face and called it vanity. Reality, shame, insecurity, trauma, and a man living under a microscope while his body changed in front of the world. People saw Neverland and laughed at the fantasy. Reality, many who knew his story saw a wounded attempt to rebuild the childhood he had been denied, a recovery space built by someone who never got to be little when he was actually little. And then came the machine that fed on all of it. Media found a label that turned complexity into mockery. Wacko Jacko. It sounded like a joke, but jokes can do serious damage when repeated enough. The nickname helped turn contempt into entertainment. It dehumanized him. It made millions feel comfortable reducing one of the most gifted artists in history to a punchline. By the time legal accusations emerged in the 1990s and later years, much of the public had already been conditioned to see him through suspicion first, evidence second. Even after his 2005 acquittal, the reputational damage did not simply disappear. And while all of this was happening, another invisible collapse was unfolding. Michael Jackson was still powerful, still rich in assets, still globally famous. He had made huge earnings, and his purchase of the ATV catalog was one of the most important entertainment investments of his era. But enormous wealth on paper did not mean stability in real life. Neverland was expensive. Legal battles were expensive. His spending was enormous, loans mounted, debt mounted. By the 2000s, a man who had once seemed untouchable was under crushing financial pressure. That pressure is what makes the final chapter so devastating. This Is It was sold as a comeback, a triumphant return. One more chance for the king to remind the world who he was. But behind that promise were warning signs. Insomnia, chronic pain, visible physical decline, fear from people close to him, and growing concern that he was too fragile for what was being demanded. Reports from that period described rehearsals overshadowed by alarming health red flags. Still, the pressure to keep going remained. And there, in the final act, the pattern of his life came back in the most tragic way. As a child, he had been pushed to perform. As an adult, he was still being pushed to perform. Different room, same pressure. Dr. Conrad Murray entered that crisis as the physician who administered propofol to help Michael sleep. A surgical anesthetic never meant to be used casually in a bedroom. On June 25, 2009, Michael Jackson died from acute propofol intoxication. The man who had once stunned America with impossible grace died inside a labyrinth of pain, insomnia, dependency, debt, and pressure that had been tightening for years. And that is why Motown 25 matters so much. Not just because it was brilliant, not just because it changed television, but because it created a level of stardom that looked divine from the outside and felt unbearable on the inside. Michael Jackson became the image of total control for a world that never fully saw how much of his life was shaped by fear, injury, illness, and isolation. He was celebrated as magic, then punished for being human. He was watched by millions, but understood by far too few. So when you go back to that night in 1983, and you see that 24-year-old glide across the stage, remember this: America thought it was watching the birth of a legend. It was, but it was also watching the beginning of a cost almost nobody could imagine. And maybe that is the real curse of being first. You change the culture forever, and the culture never learns how to protect you.